Yo, happy moon day. We back with another live video. Isis Unveiled. We on chapter 14 right now. Egyptian wisdom. So we just gonna we gonna jump straight into this thing, man. If you woke up, you winning. I've been trying to incorporate all of YouTube's little notes so I can continue to push forward with the progress. So here we go. Chapter 14.
The transactions of this our city of Sais are recorded in our sacred writings during a period of 8,000 years. Plato, Timaeus. The Egyptians assert that from the reign of Heracles to that of Amasis, 17,000 years elapsed. Herodotus, Lib. 2, c. 43. Can the theologian derive no light from the pure primeval faith that glimmers from Egyptian hieroglyphics to illustrate the immortality of the soul? Will not the historian deign to notice the prior origin of every art and science in Egypt? 1,000 years before the Pelasgians studded the isles and capes of the archipelago with their forts and temples? Glidden. How came Egypt by her knowledge? When broke the dawn of that civilization whose wondrous perfection is suggested by the bits and fragments supplied to us by the archaeologists? Alas, the lips of Memnon are silent and no longer utter oracles. The Sphinx has become a greater riddle in her speechlessness than was the enigma propounded to Oedipus. What Egypt taught to others, she certainly did not acquire by the international exchange of ideas and discoveries with her Semitic neighbors, nor from them did she receive her stimulus. The more we learn of the Egyptians, observes the writer of a recent article, the more marvelous they seem. From whom could she have learned her wondrous arts, the secrets of which died with her? She sent no agents throughout the world to learn what others knew, but to her the wise men of neighboring nations resorted for knowledge. Proudly secluding herself within her enchanted domain, the fair queen of the desert created wonders as if by the swag of a magic staff. Nothing, remarks the same writer, whom we have elsewhere quoted, proves that civilization and knowledge then rise and progress with her, as in the case of other peoples. But everything seems to be referable, in the same perfection, to the earliest dates. That no nation knew as much as herself is a fact demonstrated by history. May we not assign as a reason for this remark the fact that until very recently nothing was known of old India? That these two nations, India and Egypt, were akin? That they were the oldest in the group of nations, and that the eastern Ethiopians, the mighty builders, had come from India as a matured people, bringing their civilization with them, and colonizing the perhaps unoccupied Egyptian territory. But we defer a more complete elaboration for this theme for our second volume. Mechanism, says Eusebi Salver, was carried by the ancients to point to perfection that has never been attained in modern times. We would inquire if their inventions have been surpassed in our age. Certainly not, and at the present day, with all the means that the progress of science and modern discovery had placed in the hands of the mechanic, have we not been assailed by numerous difficulties in striving to place on a pedestal one of those monoliths that the Egyptians 40 centuries ago erected in such numbers before their sacred edifices? As far back as we can glance into history, to the reign of Menes, the most ancient of the kings that we know anything about, we find proofs that the Egyptians were far better acquainted with hydrostatics and hydraulic engineering than ourselves. The gigantic work of turning the course of the Nile, or rather of its three principal branches, and bringing it to Memphis, was accomplished during the reign of that monarch, who appears to us as distant in the abyss of time as a far glimmering star in the heavenly vault. Says Wilkinson, Menes took accurately the measure of the power which he had to oppose, and he constructed a dike whose lofty mounds and enormous embankments turned the water eastward, and since that time the river is contained in its new bed. Herodotus has left us a poetical but still accurate description of the lake Moeris, so called after the pharaoh who caused this artificial sheet of water to be formed. The historian has described this lake as measuring 450 miles in circumference and 300 feet in depth. It was fed through artificial channels by the Nile and made to store a portion of the annual overflow for the irrigation of the country for many miles round. Its numerous floodgates, dams, locks, and convenient engines were constructed with the greatest skill. The Romans, at a far later period, got their notions on hydraulic constructions from the Egyptians. But our latest progress in the science of hydrostatics has demonstrated the fact of a great deficiency on their part in some branches of that knowledge. Thus, for instance, if they were acquainted with that which is called in hydrostatics the Great Law, they seem to have been less familiar with what our modern engineers know as watertight joints. Their ignorance is sufficiently proved by their conveying the water through large level aqueducts, instead of doing it at the less expense by iron pipes beneath the surface. But the Egyptians evidently employed a far superior method in their channels and artificial waterworks. Notwithstanding this, the modern engineers employed by Lesseps for the Suez Canal, who had learned from the ancient Romans all their art could teach them, deriving in their turn their knowledge from Egypt, scoffed at the suggestion that they should seek a remedy for some imperfections in their work by studying the contents of the various Egyptian museums. Nevertheless, the engineers succeeded in giving to the banks of that long and ugly ditch, as Professor Carpenter calls the Suez Canal, sufficient strength to make it a navigable waterway, instead of a mud trap for vessels as it was at first. The alluvial deposits of the Nile, during the past 30 centuries, have completely altered the area of the delta, so that it is continually growing seaward, and adding to the territory of the Khedive. In ancient times, the principal mouth of the river was called Pelusium, and the canal cut by one of the kings, the Canal of Necho, led from Suez to this branch. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, it was proposed that a portion of the fleet should pass through the canal to the Red Sea, which shows the depth of water that those early engineers had secured. Settlers in Colorado and Arizona have recently reclaimed large tracts of barren land by a system of irrigation, receiving from the journals of the day no little praise for their ingenuity. But for a distance of 500 miles above Cairo, there stretches a strip of land reclaimed from the desert, and made, according to Professor Carpenter, the most fertile on the face of the earth. He says, for thousands of years these branch canals have conveyed fresh water from the Nile, to fertilize the land of this long narrow strip, as well as of the delta. He describes the network of canals over the delta, which dates from an early period of the Egyptian monarchs. The French province of Artois has given its name to the artesian well, as though that form of engineering had been first applied in that district. But if we consult the Chinese records, we find such wells to have been in common use ages before the Christian era. If we now turn to architecture, we find displayed before our eyes wonders which baffle all description, referring to the temples of Philae, Abu Simbel, Dendera, Edfu, and Karnak. Professor Carpenter remarks that these stupendous and beautiful erections, these gigantic pyramids and temples, have a vastness and beauty, which are still impressive after the lapse of thousands of years. He is amazed at the admirable character of the workmanship, the stones in most cases being fitted together with astonishing nicety, so that a knife could hardly be thrust between the joints. He noticed in his amateur archaeological pilgrimage another of those curious coincidences, which His Holiness, the Pope, may feel some interest in learning. He is speaking of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, sculptured on the old monuments, and the ancient belief in the immortality of the soul. Now, it is most remarkable, says the professor, to see that not only this belief, but the language in which it was expressed in the ancient Egyptian times, anticipated that of the Christian revelation. For in this Book of the Dead, there are used the very phrases we find in the New Testament in connection with the Day of Judgment, and he admits that this hierogram was engraved probably 2,000 years before the time of Christ. According to Bunsen, who is considered to have made the most exact calculations, the mass of masonry in the Great Pyramid of Cheops measures 82,111,000 feet and would weigh 6,316,000 tons. The immense numbers of squared stones shows us the unparalleled skill of the Egyptian quarrymen. Speaking of the Great Pyramid, Kenrick says, the joints are scarcely perceptible, not wider than the thickness of silver paper, and the cement is so tenacious that fragments of the casing stones still remain in their original position, notwithstanding the lapse of many centuries and the violence by which they were detached. Who, of our modern architects and chemists, will rediscover the indestructible cement of the oldest Egyptian buildings? The skill of the ancients in quarrying, says Bunsen, is displayed the most in the extracting of the huge blocks, out of which obelisks and colossal statues were hewn. Obelisks 90 feet high and statues 40 feet high, made out of one stone. There are many such. They did not blast out the blocks for these monuments, but adopted the following scientific method. Instead of using huge iron wedges, which would have split the stone, they cut a small groove for the whole length of perhaps 100 feet, and inserted in it, close to each other, a great number of dry wooden wedges, after which they poured water into the groove, and the wedges, swelling and bursting simultaneously with a tremendous force, broke out the huge stone as neatly as a diamond cuts a pane of glass. Modern geographers and geologists have demonstrated that these monoliths were brought from a prodigious distance, and have been at a loss to conjecture how the transport was effected. Old manuscripts say that it was done by the help of portable rails. These rested upon inflatable bags of hide, rendered indestructible by the same process as that used for preserving the mummies. These ingenious air cushions prevented the rails from sinking in the deep sand. Manetho mentions them and remarks that they were so well prepared that they would endure wear and tear for centuries. The date of the hundreds of pyramids in the valley of the Nile is impossible to fix by any of the rules of modern science. But Herodotus informs us that each successive king erected one to commemorate his reign, and served as his sepulchre. But Herodotus did not tell all, although he knew that the real purpose of the pyramid was very different from that which he assigns to it. Were it not for his religious scruples, he might have added that externally it symbolized the creative principle of nature. It illustrated also the principles of geometry, mathematics, astrology, and astronomy. Internally, it was a majestic fane, in whose somber recesses were performed the mysteries, and whose walls had often witnessed the initiation scenes of members of the royal family. The porphyry sarcophagus, which Professor Piazzi Smythe, Astronomer Royal of Scotland, degrades into a corn bin, was the baptismal font, upon emerging from which the neophyte was born again and became an adept. Herodotus gives us, however, a just idea of the enormous labor expended in transporting one of these gigantic blocks of granite. It measured 32 feet in length, 21 feet in width, and 12 feet in height. Its weight he estimates to be rising 300 tons. And it occupied 2,000 men for 3 years to move it from Syene to the delta down the Nile. Gliddon, in his Ancient Egypt, quotes from Pliny a description of the arrangements for moving the obelisk erected at Alexandria by Ptolemaeus Philadelphus. A canal was dug from the Nile to the place where the obelisk lay. 2 boats were floated under it. They were weighted with stones containing 1 cubic foot each. And the weight of the obelisk having been calculated by the engineers, the cargo of the boats was exactly proportioned to it, so that they should be sufficiently submerged to pass under the monolith as it lay across the canal. Then the stones were gradually removed. The boats rose, lifted the obelisk, and it was floated down the river. In the Egyptian section of the Dresden, or Berlin Museum, we forget which, is a drawing which represents a workman ascending an unfinished pyramid, with a basket of sand upon his back. This has suggested to certain Egyptologists the idea that the blocks of the pyramids were chemically manufactured in loco. Some modern engineers believe that Portland cement, a double silicate of lime and alumina, is the imperishable cement of the ancients. But on the other hand, Professor Carpenter asserts that the pyramids, with the exception of their granite casing, is formed of what geologists call nummulitic limestone. This is newer than the old chalk, and is made of the shells of animals called nummulites, like little pieces of money about the size of a shilling. However this moot question may be decided, no one, from Herodotus and Pliny down to the last wandering engineer who has gazed upon these imperial monuments of long crumbled dynasties, has been able to tell us how the gigantic masses were transported and set up in place. Bunsen concedes to Egypt an antiquity of 20,000 years. But even in this matter, we would be left to conjecture if we depended upon modern authorities. They can neither tell us what the pyramids were constructed, under what dynasty the first was raised, nor the material of which they are all built. All is conjecture with them. Professor Smythe has given us by far the most accurate mathematical description of the Great Pyramid to be found in literature, but after showing the astronomical bearings of the structure, he so little appreciates ancient Egyptian thought that he actually maintains that the porphyry sarcophagus of the king's chamber is the unit of measure for the two most enlightened nations of the earth, England and America. One of the books of Hermes describes certain of the pyramids as standing upon the seashore, the waves of which dashed in powerless fury against its base. This implies that the geographical features of the country have been changed and may indicate that we must accord to these ancient granaries, magico-astrological observatories, and royal sepulchres, an origin antedating the upheaval of the Sahara and other deserts. This would imply rather more of an antiquity than the poor few thousands of years, so generously accorded to them by Egyptologists. Dr. Ribold, a French archaeologist of some renown, gives his readers a glimpse of the culture which prevailed 5,000 years BC by saying that there were at the time no less than 30 or 40 colleges of the priests who studied occult sciences and practical magic. A writer in the National Quarterly Review, Volume 32, Number 63, December 1875, says that the recent excavations made among the ruins of Carthage have brought to light traces of a civilization, a refinement of art and luxury, which must even have outshone that of ancient Rome. And when the fiat went forth, delenda e cathargo, the mistress of the world well knew she was about to destroy a greater than herself. For while one empire swayed the world by force of arms alone, the other was the last and most perfect representative of a race who had, for centuries before Rome was dreamed of, directed the civilization, the learning, and the intelligence of mankind. This Carthage is the one which, according to Appian, was standing as early as BC 1234, or 50 years before the taking of Troy, and not the one popularly supposed to have been built by Dido, Elisa, or Astarte, 4 centuries later. Here we have still another illustration of the truth of the doctrine of cycles. Draper's admissions as to the astronomical erudition of the ancient Egyptians are singularly supported by an interesting fact quoted by Mr. J. M. Peebles from a lecture delivered in Philadelphia by the late Professor O. M. Mitchell, the astronomer. Upon the coffin of a mummy, now in the British Museum, was delineated the zodiac with the exact positions of the planets at the time of the autumnal equinox, in the year 1722 BC. Professor Mitchell calculated the exact position of the heavenly bodies belonging to our solar system at the time indicated. The result, says Mr. Peebles, I give in his own words. To my astonishment, it was found that on the 7th of October 1722 BC, the moon and the planets had occupied the exact points in the heavens marked upon the coffin in the British Museum. Professor John Fiske, in his onslaught on Dr. Draper's History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, sets his pen against the doctrine of cyclical progression, remarking that we have never known the beginning or the end of a historic cycle, and have no inductive warrant for believing that we are now traversing one. He chides the author of that eloquent and thoughtful work for the old disposition exhibited throughout his work, not only to refer the best part of Greek culture to an Egyptian source, but uniformly to exalt the non-European civilization at the expense of the European. We believe that this odd disposition might be directly sanctioned by the confessions of great Grecian historians themselves. Professor Fiske might, with profit, read Herodotus over again. The father of history confesses more than once that Greece owes everything to Egypt. As to his assertion that the world has never known the beginning or the end of an historical cycle, we have but to cast a retrospective glance on the many glorious nations which have passed away, i.e., reached the end of their great national cycle. Compare the Egypt of that day with its perfection of art, science, and religion, its glorious cities and monuments, and its swarming population, with the Egypt of today, peopled with strangers, its ruins the abode of bats and snakes, and a few Copts the sole surviving heirs to all this grandeur. and see whether the cyclical theory does not reassert itself. Says Glidden, who is now contradicted by Mr. Fiske. Philologists, astronomers, chemists, painters, architects, physicians must return to Egypt to learn the origin of language and writing, of the calendar and solar motion, of the art of cutting granite with a copper chisel, and of giving elasticity to a copper sword, of making glass with the variegated hues of the rainbow, of moving single blocks of polished syenite, 900 tons in weight, for any distance by land and water, of building arches, rounded and pointed, with Masonic precision unsurpassed at the present day, and antecedent by 2,000 years to the Cloaca Magna of Rome, of sculpturing a Doric column 1,000 years before the Dorians are known in history, of fresco painting in imperishable colors, of practical knowledge in anatomy, and of time-defying pyramid building. Every craftsman can behold, in Egyptian monuments, the progress of his art 4,000 years ago, and whether it be a wheelwright building a chariot, a shoemaker drawing his twine, a leather cutter using the self-same form of knife of old as is considered the best form now, a weaver throwing the same hand shuttle, a whitesmith using that identical form of blowpipe, but lately recognized to be the most efficient, the seal engraver cutting in hieroglyphics such names as Skuhus, above 4,300 years ago. All these and many more astounding evidences of Egyptian priority now require but a glance at the plates of Rosellini. Truly, exclaims Mr. Peebles, these Ramseyan temples and tombs were as much a marvel to the Grecian Herodotus as they are to us. But even then, the merciless hand of time had left its traces upon their structures, and some of them, whose very memory would be lost were if it not for the books of Hermes, had been swept away into the oblivion of the ages. King after king, dynasty after dynasty had passed in a glittering pageant before the eyes of succeeding generations, and their renown had filled the habitable globe. The same pall of forgetfulness had fallen upon them and their monuments alike. Before the first of our historical authorities, Herodotus, preserved for posterity the remembrance of that wonder of the world, the great labyrinth. The long-accepted biblical chronology has so cramped the minds of not only the clergy, but even our scarce, unfettered scientists, that in treating of prehistoric remains in different parts of the world, a constant fear is manifested on their part to trespass beyond the period of 6,000 years, hitherto allowed by theology as the age of the world. Herodotus found the labyrinth already in ruins, but nevertheless his admiration for the genius of its builders knew no bounds. He regarded it as far more marvelous than the pyramids themselves, and, as an eyewitness, minutely describes it. The French and Prussian savants, as well as other Egyptologists, agree as to the emplacement and identified its noble ruins. Moreover, they confirm the account given of it by the old historian. Herodotus says that he found therein 3,000 chambers, half subterranean and the other half above ground. The upper chambers, he says, I myself passed through and examined in detail. In the underground ones, which may exist till now, for all the archaeologists know, the keepers of the building would not let me in, for they contain the sepulchres of the kings who built the labyrinth, and also those of the sacred crocodiles. The upper chambers I saw and examined with my own eyes, and found them to excel all other human productions. In Rawlinson's translation, Herodotus is made to say, the passages through the houses and the varied windings of the paths across the courts excited in me infinite admiration as I passed from the courts into the chambers, and from thence into the colonnades, and from colonnades into other houses, and again into courts unseen before. The roof was throughout of stone like the walls, and both were exquisitely carved all over with figures. Every court was surrounded with a colonnade, which was built of white stones, sculptured most exquisitely. At the corner of the labyrinth stands a pyramid 40 fathoms high, with large figures engraved on it, and it is entered by a vast subterranean passage. If such was the labyrinth when viewed by Herodotus, what in such a case was ancient Thebes? The city destroyed far earlier than the period of Psammetichus, who himself reigned 530 years after the destruction of Troy. We find that in his time Memphis was the capital, while of the glorious Thebes there remained but ruins. Now, if we, who are enabled to form our estimate only by the ruins of what was already ruins so many ages before our era, are stupefied in their contemplation, what must have been the general aspect of Thebes in the days of its glory? Karnak, temple, palace, ruins, or whatsoever the archaeologists may term it, is now its only representative, but solitary and alone as it stands, fit emblem of majestic empire, as if forgotten by time in the onward march of the centuries. It testifies to the art and skill of the ancients. He must be indeed devoid of the spiritual perception of genius, who fails to feel as well as to see the intellectual grandeur of the race that planned and built it. Champollion, who passed almost his entire life in the exploration of archaeological remains, gives vent to his emotions in the following descriptions of Karnak. The ground covered by the mass of remaining buildings is square, and each side measures 1,800 feet. One is astounded and overcome by the grandeur of the sublime remnants, the prodigality and magnificence of workmanship to be seen everywhere. No people of ancient or modern times has conceived the art of architecture upon a scale so sublime, so grandiose, as it existed among the ancient Egyptians. And the imagination, which in Europe soars far above our porticos, arrests itself and falls powerless at the foot of the 140 columns of the hypostyle of Karnak. In one of its halls, the Cathedral of Notre Dame might stand alone and not touch the ceiling, but be considered as a small ornament in the center of the hall. A writer in a number of an English periodical of 1870, evidently speaking with the authority of a traveler who describes what he has seen, expresses himself as follows. Courts, halls, gateways, pillars, obelisks, monolithic figures, sculptures, long rows of sphinxes, are found in such profusion at Karnak that the sight is too much for the modern comprehension. Says Denon, the French traveler, it is hardly possible to believe, after seeing it, in the reality of the existence of so many buildings collected together on a single point, in their dimensions, in the resolute perseverance which their construction required, and in the incalculable expenses of so much magnificence. It is necessary that the reader should fancy what is before him to be a dream, as he who views the object themselves occasionally yields to the doubt whether he be perfectly awake. There are lakes and mountains within the periphery of the sanctuary. These two edifices are selected as examples from a list next to inexhaustible. The whole valley and delta of the Nile, from the cataracts to the sea, was covered with temples, palaces, tombs, pyramids, obelisks, and pillars. The execution of the sculptures is beyond praise. The mechanical perfection which artists wrought in granite, serpentine, breccia, and basalt is wonderful. According to all the experts, animals and plants look as good as natural, and artificial objects are beautifully sculptured. Battles by sea and land and scenes of domestic life are to be found in all their bas reliefs. The monuments, says an English author, which there strike the traveller, fill his mind with great ideas. At the sight of the colossuses and superb obelisks, which seem to surpass the limits of human nature, he cannot help exclaiming, "This was the work of man, and this sentiment seems to ennoble his existence." In his turn, Dr. Richardson, speaking of the Temple of Dendera, says, "The female figures are so extremely well executed that they do all but speak. They have a mildness of feature and expression that never was surpassed. Every one of these stones is covered with hieroglyphics, and the more ancient they are, the more beautifully we find them chiseled. Does not this furnish a new proof that history got its first glimpse of the ancients, when the arts were already fast degenerating among them? The obelisks have their inscriptions cut 2 inches, and sometimes more in depth, and they are cut with the highest degree of perfection. Some idea may be formed of their depth from the fact that the Arabs, for a small fee, will climb sometimes to the very top of an obelisk, by inserting their toes and fingers in the excavations of the hieroglyphics. That all of these works, in which solidity rivals the beauty of their execution, were done before the days of the Exodus, there remains no historical doubt whatever. All the archaeologists now agree in saying that the further back we go in history, the better and finer become these arts. These views clash again with the individual opinion of Mr. Fisk, who would have us believe that the sculptures upon these monuments of Egypt, Hindustan, and Assyria, moreover, betoken a very undeveloped condition of the artistic faculties. Nay, the learned gentleman goes further, joining his voice in the opposition against the claims of learning, which belongs by right to the sacerdotal castes of antiquity, to that of Lewis. He contemptuously remarks that the extravagant theory of a profound science possessed by the Egyptian priesthood from a remote antiquity and imparted to itinerant Greek philosophers has been utterly destroyed by Sir G.C. Lewis, while with regard to Egypt and Hindustan, as well as Assyria, it may be said that the colossal monuments which have adorned these countries since prehistoric times bear witness to the former prevalence of a barbaric despotism, totally incompatible with social nobility, and therefore with well-sustained progress. A curious argument indeed. If the size and grandeur of public monuments are to serve to our posterity as a standard by which to approximately estimate the progress of civilization attained by their builders, it may be prudent, perhaps, for America, so proud of her alleged progress and freedom, to dwarf her buildings at once to one story. Otherwise, according to Professor Fisk's theory, the archaeologists of A.D. 3877 will be applying to the ancient America of 1877 the rule of Lewis, and say that the ancient United States may be considered as a great latifundium or plantation cultivated by the entire population, as the king's, president's slaves. Is it because the white-skinned Aryan races were never born builders, like the Eastern Ethiopians or dark-skinned Caucasians, and therefore never able to compete with the latter in such colossal structures, that we must jump at the conclusion that these grandiose temples and pyramids could only have been erected under the whip of a merciless despot? Strange logic. It would really seem more prudent to hold to the rigorous canons of criticism laid down by Lewis and Grote, and honestly confess at once that we really know little about these ancient nations, and that, except so far as purely hypothetical speculations go, unless we study in the same direction as the ancient priests did, we have as little chance in the future. We only know what they allowed the uninitiated to know, but the little we do learn of them by deduction ought to be sufficient to assure us that, even in the 19th century, with all our claims to supremacy in arts and sciences, we are totally unable, we will not say to build anything like the monuments of Egypt, Hindustan, or Assyria, but even to rediscover the least of the ancient lost arts. Besides, Sir Gardner Wilkinson gives forcible expression to this view of the exhumed treasures of old, by adding that he can trace no primitive mode of life, no barbarous customs, but a sort of stationary civilization from the most remote periods. Thus far, archaeology disagrees with geology, which affirms that the further they trace the remains of men, the more barbarous they find them. It is doubtful if geology has even yet exhausted the field of research afforded her in the caves, and the views of geologists, which are based upon present experience, may be radically modified when they come to discover the remains of the ancestors of the people whom they now style the cave dwellers. What better illustrates the theory of cycles than the following fact? Nearly 700 years B.C., in the schools of Thales and Pythagoras was taught the doctrine of the true motion of the earth, its form, and the whole heliocentric system. And in 317 A.D., we find Lactantius, the preceptor of Crispus Caesar, son of Constantine the Great, teaching his pupil that the earth was a plain surrounded by the sky, which is composed of fire and water, and warning him against the heretical doctrine of the earth's globular form. Whenever, in the pride of some new discovery, we throw a look into the past, We find, to our dismay, certain vestiges which indicate the possibility, if not certainty, that the alleged discovery was not totally unknown to the ancients. It is generally asserted that neither the early inhabitants of the Mosaic times, nor even the more civilized nations of the Ptolemaic period, were acquainted with electricity. If we remain undisturbed in this opinion, it is not for lack of proofs to the contrary. We may disdain to search for a profounder meaning in some characteristic sentences of Servius and other writers. We cannot so obliterate them but that, at some future day, that meaning will appear to us in all its significant truths. The first inhabitants of earth, says he, never carried fire to their altars, but by their prayers they brought down the heavenly fire. Prometheus discovered and revealed to man the art of bringing down lightning, and by the method which he taught to them, they brought down fire from the region above. If after pondering these words we are still willing to attribute them to the phraseology of mythological fables, we may turn to the days of Numa, the king philosopher, so renowned for his esoteric learning, and find ourselves more embarrassed to deal with this case. We can neither accuse him of ignorance, superstition, nor credulity. For if history can be believed at all, he was intently bent on destroying polytheism and idol worship. He had so well dissuaded the Romans from idolatry that for nearly 2 centuries neither statues nor images appeared in their temples. On the other hand, old historians tell us that the knowledge which Numa possessed in natural physics was remarkable. Tradition says that he was initiated by the priests of the Etruscan divinities, and instructed by them in the secret of forcing Jupiter, the thunderer, to descend upon earth. Ovid shows that Jupiter Elysius began to be worshipped by the Romans from that time. Salvaire is of the opinion that before Franklin discovered his refined electricity, Numa had experimented with it most successfully, and that Tullus Hostilius was the first victim of the dangerous heavenly guest recorded in history. Titus Livy and Pliny narrate that this prince, having found in the books of Numa instructions on the secret sacrifices offered to Jupiter Elysius, made a mistake, and in consequence of it, he was struck by lightning and consumed in his own palace. Salvaire remarks that Pliny, in the exposition of Numa's scientific secrets, makes use of expressions which seem to indicate 2 distinct processes. The one obtained thunder, impetrare, and the other forced it to lightning, cogere. Guided by Numa's book, says Lucius, quoted by Pliny, Tullus undertook to invoke the aid of Jupiter, but having performed the rite imperfectly, he perished, struck by thunder. Tracing back the knowledge of thunder and lightning possessed by the Etruscan priests, we find that Tarchon, the founder of the theurgism of the former, desiring to preserve his house from the lightning, surrounded it by a hedge of the white byrony, a climbing plant which has the property of averting thunderbolts. Tarchon, the theurgist, was much anterior to the siege of Troy. The pointed metallic lightning rod, for which we are seemingly indebted to Franklin, is probably a rediscovery after all. There are many metals which seem to strongly indicate that the principle was anciently known. The temples of Juno had its roof covered with a quantity of pointed blades of swords. If we possess but little proof of the ancients having had any clear notions as to all the effects of electricity, there is very strong evidence, at all events, of their having been perfectly acquainted with electricity itself. Ben David, says the author of the Occult Sciences, has asserted that Moses possessed some knowledge of the phenomena of electricity. Professor Hirt of Berlin is of this opinion. Michaelis remarks firstly that there is no indication that lightning ever struck the Temple of Jerusalem during 1,000 years. Secondly, that according to Josephus, a forest of points of gold and very sharp covered the roof of the temple. Thirdly, that this roof communicated with the caverns in the hill upon which the temple was situated, by means of pipes in connection with the gilding which covered all the exterior of the building, in consequence of which the points would act as conductors. Ammianus Marcellinus, a famous historian of the 4th century, a writer generally esteemed for the fairness and correctness of his statements, tells that The Magi preserved perpetually in their furnaces fire that they miraculously got from heaven. There is a sentence in the Hindu Upanishad which runs thus: to know fire, the sun, the moon, and lightning is 3/4 of the science of God. Finally, Salver shows that in the days of Theseus, India was acquainted with the use of conductors of lightning. This historian plainly states that iron placed at the bottom of a fountain, and made in the form of a sword, with the point upward, possessed, as soon as it was thus fixed in the ground, the property of averting storms and lightnings. What can be plainer? Some modern writers deny the fact that a great mirror was placed in the lighthouse of the Alexandrian port, for the purpose of discovering vessels at a distance at sea. But the renowned Buffon believed in it, for he honestly confesses that if the mirror really existed, as I firmly believe it did, to the ancients belonged the honor of the invention of the telescope. Stephens, in his work on the East, asserts that he found railroads in Upper Egypt whose grooves were coated with iron. Canova, Powers, and other celebrated sculptures of our modern age deem it an honor to be compared with Phidias of old, and strict truth would perhaps hesitate at such a flattery. Professor Jowett discredits the story of the Atlantis and the Timaeus, and the records of 8,000 and 9,000 years appear to him an ancient swindle. But Bunsen remarks, there is nothing improbable in itself in the reminiscences and records of great events in Egypt 9,000 years BC. For the
Alright, Chad, we are 40 minutes in. Let me know what y'all found out. Let me know what y'all thought was interesting in the comments. So far, what I got, the Egyptians was into hydrostatics, meaning they was using water for electricity and for power way back then. So that's how they was moving stuff. Greece owes everything to Egypt. So fun fact, if you didn't know, the whole Greek mythology comes from the Egypt pantheon, if you didn't know. And another little fun fact, Moses knew about electricity. So if you ever watched The Prince of Egypt, I believe that story was about Moses and uh, yeah, Moses was the Messiah. He was the magician. He was the Magi. But let's get back into this.
Origins of Egypt go back to the 9th millennium before Christ. Then how about the primitive Cyclopean fortresses of ancient Greece? Can the walls of Tiryns, about which, according to archaeological accounts, even among the ancients it was reported to have been the work of the Cyclops, be deemed posterior to the pyramids? Masses of rock, some equal to a cube of 6 feet, and the smallest of which Pausanias says could never be moved by a yoke of oxen, laid up in walls of solid masonry 25 feet thick and over 40 feet high, still believed to be the work of men of the races known to our history? Wilkinson's researches have brought to light the fact that many inventions of what we term modern, and upon which we plume ourselves, were perfected by the ancient Egyptians. The newly discovered papyrus of Ebers. The German archaeologist proves that neither our modern chignons, skin-beautifying pearl powers, nor dentrifices were secrets to them. More than one modern physician, even among those who advertise themselves as having made a specialty of nervous disorders, may find his advantage in consulting the medical books of Hermes, which contain prescriptions of real therapeutic value. The Egyptians, as we have seen, excelled in all arts. They made paper so excellent in quality as to be time-proof. They took out the pith of the papyrus, says our anonymous writer, previously mentioned, dissected and opened the fiber, and flattened it by a process known to them, made it as thin as our foolscape paper, but far more durable. They sometimes cut it into strips and glued it together. Many of such written documents are yet in existence. The papyrus found in the tomb of the Queen's mummy, and another one found in the sarcophagus of the Chambre de la Reine at Giza, present the appearance of the finest glossy white muslin. while it possesses the durability of the best calf parchment. For a long time, the savants believed the papyrus to have been introduced by Alexander the Great, as they erroneously imagined a good many more things. But Lepsius found rolls of papyri in tombs and monuments of the 12th dynasty. Sculptured pictures of papyri were found later, on monuments of the 4th dynasty. And now it is proved that the art of writing was known and used as early as the days of Menes, the proto-monarch. And thus it was finally discovered from the art, and their system of writing was perfect and complete from the very first. It is to Champollion that we owe the first interpretation of their weird writing, and but for his lifelong labor, we would till now remain uninformed as to the meaning of all these pictured letters, and the ancients would still be considered ignorant by the moderns whom they so greatly excelled in some arts and sciences. He was the first to find out what wondrous tale the Egyptians had to tell, for one who could read their endless manuscripts and records. They left them on every spot an object capable of receiving characters. They engraved and chiseled and sculptured them on monuments. They traced them on furniture, rocks, stones, walls, coffins, and tombs, as on the papyrus. The pictures of their daily lives in their smallest details are being now unraveled before our dazzled eyes in the most wondrous way. Nothing of what we know seems to have been overlooked by the ancient Egyptians. The history of Sesostris shows us how well he and his people were versed in the art and practice of war. The pictures show how formidable they were when encountered in battle. They constructed war engines. Horner says that through each of the 100 gates of Thebes issued 200 men with horses and chariots. The latter were magnificently constructed, and very light in comparison with our modern heavy, clumsy, and uncomfortable artillery wagons. Kenrick describes them in the following terms. In short, as all the essential principles which regulate the construction and draft of carriages are exemplified in the war chariots of the pharaohs, so there is nothing which modern taste and luxury have devised for their decoration to which we do not find a prototype in the monuments of the 18th dynasty. Springs, metallic springs, have been found in them, and notwithstanding Wilkinson's superficial investigation in that direction, and description of these in his studies, we find proofs that such were used to prevent the jolting in the chariots in their too rapid course. The bas-relief shows us certain melees and battles in which we can find and trace their uses and customs to the smallest details. The heavily armed men fought in coats of mail. The infantry had quilted tunics and felt helmets, with metallic coverings to protect them better. Muratori, the modern Italian inventor who some 10 years ago introduced his impenetrable cuirass, but has followed in his invention what he could make out of the ancient method which suggested to him the idea. The process of rendering such objects as cardboard, felt, and other tissues impenetrable to the cuts and thrusts of any sharp weapon is now numbered among the lost arts. Muratori succeeded but imperfectly in preparing such felt cuirasses, and notwithstanding the boasted achievements of modern chemistry, he could derive from it no preparation adequate to effect his object, and failed. To what perfection chemistry had reached in ancient times may be inferred from a fact mentioned by Vieri. In his dissertations he shows that Asclepiodotus, a general of Mithridates, reproduced chemically the deleterious exhalations of the sacred grotto. These vapors, like those of Curnae, threw the Pythoness into a manic frenzy. Egyptians used bows, double-edged swords and daggers, javelins, spears, and pikes. The light troops were armed with darts and slings. Charioteers wielded maces and battle-axes. In siege operations they were perfect. The assailants, says the anonymous writer, advanced, forming a narrow and long line, the point being protected by a triple-sided, impenetrable engine pushed before them on a kind of roller, by an invisible squad of men. They had covered underground passages with trapdoors, scaling ladders, and the art of escalade and military strategy was carried by them to perfection. The battering ram was familiar to them as other things. Being such experts in quarrying, they knew how to set a mine to a wall and bring it down. The same writer remarks, that it is a great deal safer for us to mention what the Egyptians did than what they did not know, for every day brings some new discovery of their wonderful knowledge. And if he adds, we were to find out that they used Armstrong guns, this fact would not be much more astonishing than many of the facts brought out to light already.
Right.
The proof that they were proficient in mathematical sciences lies in the fact that those ancient mathematicians, whom we honor as the fathers of geometry, went to Egypt to be instructed. Says Professor Smythe, as quoted by Mr. Peebles, the geometrical knowledge of the pyramid builders began where Euclid's ended. Before Greece came into existence, the arts, with the Egyptians, were ripe and old. Land measuring, an art resting on geometry, the Egyptians certainly knew well, as according to the Bible, Joshua, after conquering the Holy Land, had skill enough to divide it. And how could a people so skilled in natural philosophy, as the Egyptians were, not be proportionately skilled in psychology and spiritual philosophy? The temple was the nursery of the highest civilization, and it alone possessed that higher knowledge of magic which was in itself the quintessence of natural philosophy.
Hello.
The occult powers of nature were taught in the greatest secrecy, and the most wonderful cures were performed during the performing of the mysteries. Herodotus acknowledges that the Greeks learned all that they knew, including the sacred services of the temple, from the Egyptians. And because of that, their principal temples were consecrated to Egyptian divinities. Melampus, the famous healer and soothsayer of Argos, had to use his medicines after the manner of the Egyptians, from whom he had gained his knowledge, whenever he desired his cure to be thoroughly effective. He healed Iphiclus of his impotency and debility by the rust of iron, according to the directions of Mantis, his magnetic sleeper, or oracle. Sprengel gives many wonderful instances of such magical cures in his History of Medicine. See page 119. Diodorus, in his work on the Egyptians, Lib 1, says that Isis has deserved immortality, for all nations of the earth bear witness to the power of this goddess to cure disease by her influence. This is proved, he says, not by fable as among the Greeks, but by authentic facts. Galen records several remedial means which were preserved in the healing wards of the temples. He mentions also a universal medicine which in his time was called Isis. The doctrines of several Greek philosophers who had been instructed in Egypt demonstrates their profound learning. Orpheus, who according to Artapanus was a disciple of Moses, Pythagoras, Herodotus, and Plato owe their philosophy to the same temples in which the wise Solon was instructed by their priests. Anticylides relates, says Pliny, that the letters were invented in Egypt by a person whose name was Menon, 15 years before Pharonius, the most ancient king of Greece. Jablonski proves that the heliocentric system, as well as the Earth's sphericity, were known by the priests of Egypt from immemorial ages. This theory, he adds, Pythagoras took from the Egyptians, who had it from the Brahmins of India. Fenelon, the illustrious Archbishop of Cambrai, in his Lives of the Ancient Philosophers, credits Pythagoras with this knowledge, and says that besides teaching his disciples that the earth was round, they were antipodes, since it was inhabited everywhere. The great mathematician was first to discover that the morning and evening star was the same. If we now consider that Pythagoras lived about the 16th Olympiad, over 700 years BC, and taught this fact at such an early period, we must believe that it was known by others before him. The works of Aristotle, Laurentius, and several others in which Pythagoras is mentioned, demonstrate that he had learned from the Egyptians about the obliquity of the ecliptic, the starry composition of the Milky Way, and the borrowed light of the moon. Wilkinson, corroborated later by others, says that the Egyptians divided time, knew the true length of the year and the precession of the equinoxes. By recording the rising and setting of the stars, they understood the particular influences which proceed from the positions and conjunctions of all the heavenly bodies, and therefore their priests, prophesying as accurately as our modern astronomers, meteorological changes, could, en plus, astrologize through astral motions. Though the sober and eloquent Cicero may be partially right in his indignation against the exaggerations of the Babylonian priests, who assert that they have preserved upon monuments observations extending back during an interval of 470,000 years, still the period at which astronomy had arrived at its perfection with the ancients is beyond the reach of modern calculation. A writer in one of our scientific journals observes that every science in its growth passes through three stages. First, we have the stage of observation, when facts are collected and registered by many minds in many places. Next, we have the stage of generalization, when these carefully verified facts are arranged methodically, generalized systematically, and classified logically, so as to deduce and elucidate from them the laws that regulate their rule and order. Lastly, we have the stage of prophecy, when these laws are so applied that events can be predicted to occur with unerring accuracy. If several thousand years BC, Chinese and Chaldean astronomers predicted eclipses, the latter, whether by the cycle of Saros or other means, matters not. The fact remains the same. They had reached the last and highest stage of astronomical science. They prophesied. If they could, in the year 1722 BC, delineate the zodiac with the exact positions of the planets at the time of the autumnal equinox, and so unerringly as Professor Mitchell, the astronomer, proved, then they knew the laws that regulate carefully verified facts to perfection and applied them with as much certainty as our modern astronomers. Moreover, astronomy is said to be in our century the only science which has thoroughly reached the last stage. Other sciences are yet in various stages of growth. Electricity, in some branches, has reached the third stage, but in many branches is still in its infantine period. This we know on the exasperating confessions of men of science themselves, and we can entertain no doubt as to this sad reality in the 19th century, as we belong ourselves to it. Not so in relation to the men who lived in the days of the glory of Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylon. Of the stages they reached in other sciences we know nothing, except that in astronomy they stood equal with us, for they had also reached the third stage and last stage. In this lecture on the lost arts, Wendell Phillips very artistically describes the situation. We seem to imagine, says he, that whether knowledge will die with us or not, it certainly began with us. We have a pitying estimate, a tender pity for the narrowness, ignorance, and darkness of the bygone ages. To illustrate our own idea with the closing sentence of the favorite lecturer, we may as well confess that we undertook this chapter, which in one sense interrupts our narrative, to inquire of our men of science whether they are sure that they are boasting on the right line. Thus we read of a people who, according to some learned writers, had just emerged from the Bronze Age into the succeeding age of iron. If Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylon presented stupendous and venerable antiquities reaching far back into the night of time, Persia was not without her wonders of a later date. The pillared halls of Persepolis were filled with miracles of art, carvings, sculptures, enamels, alabaster libraries, obelisks, sphinxes, colossal bulls. Ecbatana in Media, the cool summer retreat of the Persian kings, was defended by 7 encircling walls of hewn and polished blocks, the interior ones in succession of increasing height and of different colors, in astrological accordance with the 7 planets. The palace was roofed with silver tiles, its beams were plated with gold. At midnight in its halls the sun was rivaled by many a row of naphtha cressets. A paradise, that luxury of the monarchs of the East, was planted in the midst of a city. The Persian Empire was truly the garden of the world. In Babylon there still remained its walls, once more than 60 miles in compass, and after the ravages of 3 centuries and 3 conquerors, still more than 80 feet in height. There were still the ruins of the temple of the cloud-encompassed Bel. On its top was planted the observatory wherein the weird Chaldean astronomers had held nocturnal communion with the stars. Still there were vestiges of the 2 palaces with their hanging gardens, in which there were trees growing in mid-air, and the wreck of the hydraulic machinery that had supplied them from the river. Into the artificial lake, with its vast apparatus of aqueducts and sluices, the melted snows of the Armenian mountains found their way, and were confined in their course through the city by the embankments of the Euphrates. Most wonderful of all, perhaps, was the tunnel under the riverbed. In his First Traces of Man in Europe, Ulrich Müller proposes a name descriptive of the age in which we live, and suggests that the age of paper is perhaps as good as any that can be discussed. We do not agree with the learned professor. Our firm opinion is that succeeding generations will term ours at best the age of brass, at worst that of Albada or of Oreide. The thought of the present-day commentator and critic as to the ancient learning is limited to and runs around the exotericism of the temples. His insight is either unwilling or unable to penetrate into the solemn aditya of old, where the Hierophant instructed the neophyte to regard the public worship in its true light. No ancient sage would have taught that man is the king of creation, and that the starry heaven and our mother earth were created for his sake. He who doubts the assertion may turn to the magical and philosophical precepts of Zoroaster, and find its corroboration in the following. Direct not thy mind to the vast measures of the earth, for the plant of truth is not upon ground. For measure the measures of the sun, collecting rules, for he is carried by the eternal will of the Father, not for your sake. Dismiss the impetuous course of the moon, for she runs always by work of necessity. The progression of the stars was not generated for your sake. A rather strange teaching to come from those who are universally believed to have worshipped the sun and moon and the starry host as gods. The sublime profundity of the Magian precepts being beyond the reach of modern materialistic thought, the Chaldean philosophers are accused, together with the ignorant masses, of Sabianism and sun worship. There was a vast difference between the true worship taught to those who showed themselves worthy and the state religions. The Magians are accused of all kinds of superstition, but this is what a Chaldean oracle says. The wide aerial flight of birds is not true, nor the dissections of the entrails of victims. They are all mere toys, the basis of mercenary fraud. Flee from these, if you would open the sacred paradise of piety, where virtue, wisdom, and equity are assembled. Surely it is not those who warn people against mercenary fraud who would be accused of it, and if they accomplished acts which seem miraculous, who can with fairness presume to deny that it was done merely because they possessed a knowledge of natural philosophy and psychological science to a degree unknown to our schools? What did they not know? It is a well-demonstrated fact that the true meridian was correctly ascertained before the first pyramid was built. They had clocks and dials to measure time. Their cubit was the established unit of a linear measure, being 1,707 feet of English measure. According to Herodotus, the unit of weight was also known. As money, they had gold and silver rings valued by weight. They had the decimal and duodecimal modes of calculation from the earliest times. They were proficient in algebra. How could they otherwise, says an unknown author, bring into operation such immense mechanical powers, if they had not thoroughly understood the philosophy of what we term the mechanical powers? The art of making linen and fine fabrics is also proved to have been one of their branches of knowledge, for the Bible speaks of it. Joseph was presented by Pharaoh with a vesture of fine linen, a golden chain, and many more things. The linen of Egypt was famous throughout the world. The mummies were all wrapped in it, and linen is beautifully preserved. Pliny speaks of a certain garment sent 600 years BC by King Amasis to Lindus, every single thread of which was composed of 360 minor threads twisted together. Herodotus gives us, Book 1, in his account of Isis and the mysteries performed in her honor, an idea of the beauty and admirable softness of the linen worn by the priests. The latter wore shoes made of papyrus and garments of fine linen, because this goddess first taught the use of it, and thus, besides being called Azaiki, or priests of Isis, they were also known as Linigera, or the linen-wearing. This linen was spun and dyed in those brilliant and gorgeous colors, the secret of which is likewise now among the lost arts. On the mummies we often find the most beautiful embroidery and beadwork ornamenting their shirts. Several of such can be seen in the Museum of Bulak, Cairo, and are unsurpassable in beauty. The designs are exquisite, and the labor seems immense. The elaborate and so much vaunted Goblin's tapestry is but a gross production when compared with some of the embroidery of the ancient Egyptians. We have but to refer to Exodus to discover how skillful was the workmanship of the Israelitish pupils of the Egyptians upon their tabernacle and sacred ark. The sacerdotal vestments, with their decorations of pomegranates and golden bells, and the thummim, or jeweled breastplate of the high priest, are described by Josephus as being of unparalleled beauty and of wonderful workmanship. And yet we find beyond doubt that the Jews adopted their rites and ceremonies, and even the special dress of their Levites, from the Egyptians. Clemens Alexandrinus acknowledges it very reluctantly, and so does Origen and the fathers of the Church, some of whom, as a matter of course, attribute the coincidence to a clever trick of Satan in anticipation of events. Proctor, the astronomer, says in one of his books, "The remarkable breastplate worn by the Jewish high priest was derived directly from the Egyptians." The word thummim itself is evidently of Egyptian origin, borrowed by Moses, like the rest. For further on the same page, Mr. Proctor says that, in the often repeated picture of the judgment, the deceased Egyptian is seen conducted by the god Horus, while Anubis places on one of the balances a vase supposed to contain his good actions, and in the other is the emblem of truth, a representation of Thmi, the goddess of truth, which was also worn on the judicial breastplate. Wilkinson, in his Manners and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians, shows that the Hebrew thummim is a plural form of the word Thmi. All the ornamental arts seem to have been known to the Egyptians. Their jewelry of gold, silver, and precious stones are beautifully wrought. So was the cutting, polishing, and setting of them executed by their lapidaries of the finest style. The finger ring of an Egyptian mummy, if we remember aright, was pronounced to the most artistic piece of jewelry in the London exhibition of 1851. Their imitation of precious stones in glass is far above anything done at the present day, and the emerald may be said to have been imitated to perfection. In Pompeii, says Wendell Phillips, they discovered a room full of glass. There was ground glass, window glass, cut glass, and colored glass of every variety. Catholic priests who broke into China 200 years ago were shown a glass transparent and colorless, which was filled with liquor made by the Chinese, and which appeared to be colorless like water. This liquor was poured into the glass, and then looking through, it seemed to be filled with fishes. They turned it out and repeated the experiment, and again it was filled with fishes. In Rome, they show a bit of glass, a transparent glass, which they light up so as to show that there is nothing concealed. But in the center of the glass is a drop of colored glass, perhaps as large as a pea, modeled like a duck, and which even a miniature pencil could not do more perfectly. It is manifest that this drop of liquid glass must have been poured because there is no joint. This must have been done by a greater heat than the annealing process, because that process shows breaks. In relation to their wonderful art of imitating precious stones, the lecturer speaks of the celebrated vase of the Genoa Cathedral, which was considered for long centuries a solid emerald. The Roman Catholic legend of it was that it was one of the treasures that the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon, and that it was the identical cup of which the Savior drank at the Last Supper. Subsequently, it was not found to be an emerald, but an imitation, and when Napoleon brought it to Paris and gave it to the Institute, the scientists were obliged to confess that it was not a stone, and that they could not tell what it was. Further, speaking of the skill of the ancients in metalworks, the same lecturer narrates that when the English plundered the summer palace of the Emperor of China, the European artists were surprised at seeing the curiously wrought metal vessels of every kind, far exceeding all the boasted skill of the workmen of Europe. African tribes in the interior of the country gave travelers better razors than they had. George Thompson told me, he adds, he saw a man in Calcutta throw a handful of floss silk into the air, and a Hindu sever it into pieces with his saber of native steel. He concludes by the apt remark that the steel is the greatest triumph of metallurgy, and metallurgy is the glory of chemistry. So with the ancient Egyptians and Semitic races. They dug gold and separated it with the utmost skill. copper, lead, and iron were found in abundance near the Red Sea. In a lecture delivered in 1873 on the cavemen of Devonshire, Mr. W. Pengelly, FRS, stated on the authority of some Egyptologists that the first iron was used in Egypt was meteoric iron, as the earliest mention of this metal is found in an Egyptian document, in which it is called the stone from heaven. This would imply the idea that the only iron which was used in the days of old was meteorite. This may have been the case at the commencement of the period embraced in our present geological explorations, but till we can compute with at least approximate accuracy the age of our excavated relics, who can tell but that we are making a blunder of possibly several 100,000 years? The injudiciousness of dogmatizing upon what the ancient Chaldeans and Egyptians did not know about mining and metallurgy is at least partially shown by the discoveries of Colonel Howard Yeats. Moreover, many of such precious stones are only to be found at a great depth, and mines are mentioned in Homer and the Hebrew Scriptures. Have scientists ascertained the precise time when mining shafts were first sunk by mankind? According to Dr. A.C. Hamlin in India, the arts of the goldsmith and lapidary have been practiced from an unknown antiquity. That the Egyptians either knew from the remotest ages how to temper steel, or possessed something still better and more perfect than the implement necessary in our days for chiseling, is an alternative from which the archaeologists cannot escape. How else could they have produced such artistic chiseling, or wrought such sculpture as they did? The critics may take their choice of either, according to them, steel tools of the most exquisite temper, or some other means of cutting syenite, granite, and basalt, which in the latter case must be added to the long catalogue of lost arts. Professor Albrecht Müller says, "We may ascribe the introduction of bronze manufacture into Europe to a great race immigrant from Asia some 6,000 years ago, called Aryas or Aryans. Civilization of the East preceded that of the West by many centuries. There are proofs that a considerable degree of culture existed at its very beginning. Bronze was yet in use, but iron as well. Pottery was not only shaped on the lathe, but burned a good red. Manufactures in glass, gold, and silver are found for the first time. In lonely mountain places are yet found dross, and the remains of iron furnaces. To be sure, this dross is sometimes ascribed to volcanic action, but it is met with where volcanoes never could have existed. But it is in the process of preparing mummies that the skill of this wonderful people is exemplified in the highest degree. None but those who have made special study of the subject can estimate the amount of skill, patience, and knowledge exacted for the accomplishment of the indestructible work, which occupied several months. Both chemistry and surgery were called into requisition. The mummies, if left in the dry climate of Egypt, seem to be practically imperishable, and even when removed after a repose of several thousand years, show no signs of change. The body, says the anonymous writer, was filled with myrrh, cassia, and other gums, and after that saturated with natron. Then followed the marvelous swathing of the embalmed body, so artistically executed that professional modern bandagists are lost in admiration at its excellency, says Dr. Granville. There is not a single form of bandage known to modern surgery, of which far better and cleverer examples are not seen in the swathings of the Egyptian mummies. The strips of linen are found without one single joint, extending to 1,000 yards in length. Rossellini and Kenrick's Ancient Egypt gives a similar testimony to the wonderful variety and skill with which the bandages have been applied and interlaced. There was not a fracture in the human body that could not be repaired successfully by the sacerdotal physician of those remote days. Who but well remembers the excitement produced some 25 years ago by the discovery of anesthesia, the nitrous oxide gas, sulfuric and chloric ether, chloroform, laughing gas, besides various other combinations of these, were welcomed as so many heavenly blessings to the suffering portion of humanity. Poor Dr. Horace Wells of Hartford in 1844 was the discoverer, and Doctors Morton and Jackson reaped the honors and benefits in 1846, as is usual in such cases. The anesthetics were proclaimed the greatest discovery ever made. And though the famous lithion of Morton and Jackson, a compound of sulfuric ether, the chloroform of Sir James Y. Simpson, and the nitrous oxide gas, introduced by Colton in 1843 and by Dunham and Smith, were occasionally checked by fatal cases, it still did not prevent these gentlemen from being considered public benefactors. The patients, successfully put to sleep, sometimes awoke no more. What matters that, so long as others were relieved? Physicians assure us that accidents are now but rarely apprehended. Perhaps it is because the beneficent anesthetic agents are so parsimoniously applied as to fail in their effects one half of the time, leaving the sufferer paralyzed for a few seconds in his external movements, but feeling the pain as acutely as ever. On the whole, however, chloroform and laughing gas are beneficent discoveries. But are they the first anesthetics ever discovered, strictly speaking? Dioscorides speaks of the stone of Memphis, lapis memphiticus, and describes it as a small pebble, round, polished, and very sparkling. When ground into powder and applied as an ointment to that part of the body on which the surgeon was about to operate, either with his scalpel or fire, it preserved that part, and only that part, from any pain of the operation. In the meantime, it was perfectly harmless to the constitution of the patient, who retained his consciousness throughout, in no way dangerous from its effects, and acted so long as it was kept on the affected part. When taken in a mixture of wine or water, all feeling of suffering was perfectly deadened. Pliny gives also a full description of it. From time immemorial, the Brahmins have had in their possession secrets quite as valuable. The widow, bent on the self-sacrifice of confirmation, called Sahamariyana, has no dread of suffering the least pain, for the fiercest flames will consume her, without one pang of agony being experienced by her. The holy plants which crown her brow, as she is conducted in ceremony to the funeral pile, the sacred root called at the midnight hour on the spot where the Ganges and the Yuma mingle their waters, and the process of anointing the body of the self-appointed victim with ghee and sacred oils, after she is bathed in all her clothes and finery, are so many magical anesthetics. Supported by those she is going to part with in body, she walks thrice around her fiery couch, and after bidding them farewell is cast on the dead body of her husband, and leaves this world without a single moment of suffering. The semi-fluid, says a missionary writer, an eyewitness of several such ceremonies, the ghee is poured upon the pile. It is instantly aflamed, and the drugged widow dies quickly of suffocation before the fire reaches her body. No such thing if the sacred ceremony is only conducted strictly after the prescribed rites. The widows are never drugged in the sense we are accustomed to understand the word. Only precautionary measures are taken against a useless physical martyrdom, the atrocious agony of burning. Her mind is as free and clear as ever, and even more so. Firmly believing in the promises of a future life, her whole mind is absorbed in the contemplation of the approaching bliss, the beatitude of freedom, which she is about to attain. She generally dies with a smile of heavenly rapture on her countenance, and if someone is to suffer at the hour of retribution, it is not the earnest devotee of her faith, but the crafty Brahmins who know well enough that no such ferocious rite was ever prescribed. As to the victim, after having been consumed, she becomes a sati, transcendent purity, and is canonized after death. Egypt is the birthplace and the cradle of chemistry. Kenrick shows the root of the word to be chemi or chem, which was the name of the country, Psalms CV 27. The chemistry of colors seems to have been thoroughly well known in that country. Facts are facts. Where among our painters are we to search for the artist who can decorate our walls with imperishable colors? Ages after our pygmy buildings will have crumbled into dust, and the cities enclosing them will themselves have become shapeless heaps of brick and mortar, with forgotten names, Long after that will the halls of Karnak and Luxor be still standing, and the gorgeous mural paintings of the latter will doubtless be as bright and vivid 4,000 years hence, as they were 4,000 years ago, and are today. Embalming and fresco painting, says our author, was not a chance discovery with the Egyptians, but brought out from definitions and maxims like any induction of Faraday. Our modern Italians boast of their Etruscan vases and paintings. The decorative borders found on Greek vases provoke the admiration of the lovers of antiquity, and are ascribed to the Greeks, while in fact they were but copies from the Egyptian vases. Their figures can be found any day on the walls of a tomb of the age of Amenhotep I, a period at which Greek was not even in existence. Where in our age can we point to anything comparable to the rock temples of Ipsambol in Lower Nubia? There may be seen sitting figures 70 feet high, carved out of the living rock. The torso of the statue of Ramses II at Thebes measures 60 feet around the shoulders, and elsewhere in proportion. Besides such titanic sculpture, our own seems that of pygmies. Iron was known to the Egyptians at least long before the construction of the first pyramid, which is over 20,000 years ago, according to Bunsen. The proof of this had remained hidden for thousands of years in the Pyramid of Cheops, until Colonel Howard Weiss found it in the shape of a piece of iron, in one of the joints where it had evidently been placed at the time this pyramid was first built. Egyptologists adduce many indications that the ancients were perfectly well acquainted with metallurgy in prehistoric times. To this day we can find at Sinai large heaps of scoriae produced by smelting. Metallurgy and chemistry, as practiced in those days, were known as alchemy, and were at the bottom of prehistoric magic. Moreover, Moses proved his knowledge of alchemical chemistry by pulverizing the golden calf and strewing the powder upon the water. If we now turn to navigation, we will find ourselves able to prove, on good authorities, that Necho II fitted out a fleet on the Red Sea and dispatched it for exploration. The fleet was absent above 2 years, and instead of returning through the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, as was wont, sailed back through the Straits of Gibraltar. Herodotus was not at all swift to concede to the Egyptians a maritime achievement so vast as this. They had, he says, been spreading the report that, returning homewards, they had the sunrise on their right hands, a thing which to me is incredible. And yet, remarks the author of the heretofore mentioned article, this incredible assertion is now proved incontestable, as may well be understood by anyone who has doubled the Cape of Good Hope. Thus it is proved that the most ancient of these people performed a feat which was attributed to Columbus many ages later. They say that they anchored twice on their way, sowed corn, reaped it, and sailed away, steered in triumph through the Pillars of Hercules, and eastward along the Mediterranean. There was a people, he adds, much more deserving of the term veters than the Romans and Greeks. The Greeks, young in their knowledge, sounded a trumpet before these and called upon all the world to admire their ability. Old Egypt, grown grey in her wisdom, was so secure of her acquirements that she did not invite admiration and cared no more for the opinion of the flippant Greek than we do today for that of a Fiji Islander. "O Solon, Solon," said the oldest Egyptian priest to that sage, "you Greeks are ever childish, having no ancient opinion, no discipline of any long standing." And very much surprised indeed was the great Solon, when he was told by the priests of Egypt that so many gods and goddesses of the Grecian pantheon were but the disguised gods of Egypt. "Truly," spoke Zonaras, "all these things came to us from Chaldea to Egypt, and from thence were derived to the Greeks." Sir David Brewster gives a glowing description of several automata, and the 18th century takes pride in that masterpiece of mechanical art, the flute player of Vaucanson. The little we can glean of positive information on that subject, from ancient writers, warrants the belief that the learned mechanicians in the days of Archimedes, and some of them more anterior to the great Syracusan, were in no wise more ignorant or less ingenious than our modern inventors. Archytas a native of Tarentum in Italy, the instructor of Plato, a philosopher distinguished for his mathematical achievements and wonderful discoveries in practical mechanics, constructed a wooden dove. It must have been an extraordinary ingenious mechanism, as it flew, fluttered its wings, and sustained itself for a considerable time in the air. The skillful man who lived 400 years BC invented, besides the wooden dove, the screw, the crane, and various hydraulic machines. Egypt pressed her own grapes and made wine. Nothing remarkable in that so far. But she brewed her own beer, and in great quantity. Our Egyptologist goes on to say, the Ebers manuscript proves now, beyond doubt, that the Egyptians used beer 2,000 years BC. Their beer must have been strong and excellent, like everything they did. Glass was manufactured in all its varieties. In many of the Egyptian sculptures, we find scenes of glass blowing and bottles. Occasionally, during archaeological researches, glasses and glassware are found, and very beautiful they seem to have been. Sir Gardner Wilkinson says that the Egyptians cut, ground, and engraved glass, and possessed the art of introducing gold between the two surfaces of the substance. They imitated with glass, pearls, emeralds, and all the precious stones to a great perfection. Likewise, the most ancient Egyptians cultivated the musical arts, and understood well the effect of musical harmony and its influence on the human spirit. We can find on the oldest sculptures and carvings scenes in which musicians play on various instruments. Music was used in the healing department of the temples for the cure of nervous disorders. We discover on many monuments men playing in bands in concert, the leader beating time by clapping his hands. Thus far we can prove that they understood the laws of harmony. They had their sacred music, domestic and military. The lyre, harp, and flute were used for the sacred concerts. For festive occasions they had the guitar, the single and double pipes, and castanets. For troops and during military service they had trumpets, tambourines, drums, and cymbals. Various kinds of harps were invented by them, such as the lyre, sambuc, asher. Some of these had upward of 20 strings. The superiority of the Egyptian lyre over the Grecian is an admitted fact. The material out of which were made such instruments was often of very costly and rare wood, and they were beautifully carved. They imported it sometimes from very distant countries. Some were painted, inlaid with mother of pearl, and ornamented with colored leather. They used catgut for strings, as we do. Pythagoras learned music in Egypt and made a regular science of it in Italy. But the Egyptians were generally considered in antiquity as the best music teachers in Greece. They understood thoroughly well how to extract harmonious sounds out of an instrument by adding strings to it, as well as the multiplication of notes by shortening the strings upon its neck, which knowledge shows a great progress in the musical art. Speaking of harps, in a tomb at Thebes, Bruce remarks that they overturn all the accounts hitherto given of the earliest date of music and musical instruments in the East, and are altogether in their form ornaments in compass, an incontestable proof, stronger than 1,000 Greek quotations, that geometry, drawing, mechanics, and music were at the greatest perfection when these instruments were made, and that the period from which we date the invention of these arts was only the beginning of the era of the Restoration. On the walls of the palace of Amenhotep II at Thebes, the king is represented as playing chess with the queen. This monarch reigned long before the Trojan War. In India, the game is known to have been played at least 5,000 years ago. As to their knowledge in medicine, now that one of the lost books of Hermes has been found and translated by Ebers, the Egyptians can speak for themselves. That they understood about the circulation of blood appears certain from the healing manipulations of the priests, who knew how to draw blood downward, stop its circulation for a while, etc. A more careful study of their bas reliefs represented scenes taking place in the healing hall of various temples will easily demonstrate it.
It's really just crazy how advanced these Egyptians were, man. It's like these motherfuckers was living in year 5,000 and we over here in year 2026 and don't got a fucking clue still, man. God damn. Shit. And now, by the way, Let me know what y'all thought was interested in the comments so far. Egypt knew about astronomy, hence the pyramid. The Great Pyramid is perfect, all that good stuff as far as its location and its logistical analytics. Egypt is the birthplace of chemistry. If you didn't know, Egypt is not its original name. Its original name is Kemet. Hence Kemet, chemistry, chemistry, Kemet. So that's where you get that. They also had beer 2000 BC with engraved glass cups. So motherfuckers was on that good juice, getting buzzed back in the day on that what's that shit called? On that damn, not the spirits, not the myrrh. Uh, fuck. But anyhow, yeah, we got about, I can tell you, we got 31 minutes left in this chapter. The last chapter is gonna be about esoteric India. So Egypt, if you didn't know, Egypt and India are the two highest cradles of civilization that has been recorded on this realm, like in great detail, I should say. So if people ain't talking Egypt Egypt, ancient Kim, India, Jainism, the Vedas, anything like that, like just when it comes to this realm, like that's like base level. They ain't talking about shit. And then going back to nature, of course. There we go.
They had their dentists and oculists, and no doctor was allowed to practice more than one specialty, which certainly warrants the belief that they lost fewer patients in those days than our physicians do now. It is also asserted by some authorities that the Egyptians were the first people in the world who introduced trial by jury, although we doubt this ourselves. But the Egyptians were not the only people of remote epochs whose achievements placed them in so commanding a position before the view of posterity. Besides others whose history is at present shut in behind the mists of antiquity, such as the prehistoric races of the two Americas, of Crete, of the Troad, of the Lacustrians, of the submerged continent of the fabled Atlantis, now classed with myths, the deeds of the Phoenicians stamp them with almost the character of demigods. The writer in the National Quarterly Review, previously quoted, says that the Phoenicians were the earliest navigators of the world, founded most of the colonies of the Mediterranean, and voyaged to whatever other regions were inhabited. They visited the Arctic regions, whence they brought accounts of eternal days without a night, which Homer had preserved for us in the Odyssey. From the British Isles they imported tin to Africa, and Spain was a favorite site for their colonies. The description of Charybdis so completely answers to the maelstrom that, as this writer says, it is difficult to imagine it had any other prototype. Their explorations, it seems, extended in every direction, their sails whitening the Indian Ocean as well as the Norwegian fjords. Different writers have accorded to them the settlement of remote localities, while the entire southern coast of the Mediterranean was occupied by their cities. A large portion of the African territory is asserted to have been peopled by the races expelled by Joshua and the children of Israel. At the time when Procopius wrote, columns stood in Mauritania, Tingitana, which bore the inscription in Phoenician characters, "We are those who fled before the brigand Joshua, the son of Nun or Knave." Some suppose these hardy navigators of Arctic and Antarctic waters have been the progenitors of the races which built the temples and palaces of Palenque and Uxmal, of Copan and Arica. Brasseur de Bourbourg gives us as much information about the manners and customs, architecture and arts, and especially of the magic and magicians of the ancient Mexicans. He tells us that Wotan, their fabulous hero and the greatest of their magicians, returning from a long voyage, visited King Solomon at the time of the building of the temple. This Wotan appears to be identical with the dreaded Quetzalcoatl, who appears in all the Mexican legends, and curiously enough these legends bear a striking resemblance, insomuch as they relate to the voyages and exploits of the Hittim, with the Hebrew Bible accounts of the Hivites, the descendants of Heth, son of Chanaan. The record tells us that Wotan furnished to Solomon the most valuable particulars as to the men, animals, and plants, the gold and precious woods of the Occident, but refused point blank to afford any clue to the route he sailed, or the manner of reaching the mysterious continent. Solomon himself gives an account of this interview in his History of the Wonders of the Universe, the chief Wotan figuring under the allegory of the navigating serpent. Stevens, indulging in the anticipation that a key surer than that of the Rosetta Stone will be discovered, by which the American hieroglyphs may be read, says that the descendants of the Caciques and the Aztec subjects are believed to survive still in the inaccessible fastnesses of the Cordilleras, wilderness which have never yet been penetrated by a white man, living as their fathers did, erecting the same buildings, with ornaments of sculpture and plastered, large courts and lofty towers with high ranges of steps, and still carving on tablets of stone the same mysterious hieroglyphics. He adds, I turn to that vast and unknown region, untraversed by a single road, wherein fancy pictures that mysterious city seen from the topmost range of the Cordilleras, of unconquered, unvisited, and unsought aboriginal inhabitants. Apart from the fact that this mysterious city has been seen from a great distance by daring travelers, there is no intrinsic improbability of its existence, for who can tell what became of the primitive people who fled before the rapacious brigands of Cortez and Pizarro? Dr. Chuddy, in his work on Peru, tells us of an Indian legend that a train of 10,000 llamas, laden with gold to complete the unfortunate Inca's ransom, was arrested in the Andes by the tidings of his death, and the enormous treasure was so effectually concealed that not a trace of it has ever been found. He, as well as Prescott and other writers, informs us that the Indians to this day preserve their ancient traditions and sacerdotal caste, and obey implicitly the orders of rulers chosen among themselves, while at the same time nominally Catholics and actually subject to the Peruvian authorities. Magical ceremonies practiced by their forefathers still prevail among them, and magical phenomena occur. So persistent are they in their loyalty to the past that it seems impossible but that they should be in relations with some central source of authority, which constantly supports and strengthens their faith, keeping it alive. May it not be that the sources of this undying faith lie in this mysterious city, with which they are in secret communication? Or must we think that all of the above is again but a curious coincidence? The story of this mysterious city was told to Stevens by a Spanish padre in 1838-1839. The priest swore to him that he had seen it with his own eyes, and gave Stevens the following details, which the traveler firmly believed to be true. The padre of the little village near the ruins of Santa Cruz del Quiche had heard of the unknown city at the village of Chayul. He was then young and climbed with much labor to the naked summit of the topmost ridge of the Sierra of the Cordillera. When arrived at the height of 10 or 12,000 feet, he looked over an immense plain extending to Yucatan in the Gulf of Mexico, and saw at a great distance a large city spread over a great space, and with turrets white and glittering in the sun. Tradition says that no white man has ever reached the city, that the inhabitants speak the Maya language, know that strangers have conquered their whole land, and murder any white man who attempts to enter their territory. They have no coin, no horse, cattle, mules, or other domestic animals except fowls, and the cocks they keep underground to prevent their crowing being heard. Nearly the same was given to us personally about 20 years ago, by an old native priest whom we met in Peru, and with whom we happened to have business relations. He had passed all his life vainly trying to conceal his hatred toward the conquerors. Brigands, he termed them, and as he confessed, kept friends with them and the Catholic religion for the sake of his people. But he was as truly a sun worshipper in his heart as he ever was. He had traveled in his capacity of a converted native missionary, and had been at Santa Cruz, and as he solemnly affirmed, had been also to see some of his people by a subterranean passage, leading into the mysterious city. We believe his account, for a man who is about to die will rarely stop to invent idle stories, and this one we have found corroborated in Stephen's travels. Besides, we know of 2 other cities utterly unknown to European travelers. Not that the inhabitants particularly desire to hide themselves, for people from Buddhistic countries come occasionally to visit them. But their towns are not set down on the European or Asiatic maps, and on account of the 2 zealous and enterprising Christian missionaries, and perhaps for more mysterious reasons of their own, the few natives of other countries who are aware of the existence of these 2 cities never mention them. Nature has provided strange nooks and hiding places for her favorites, and unfortunately it is but far away from so-called civilized countries that man is free to worship the deity in the way that his fathers did. Even the erudite and sober Max Muller is somehow unable to get rid of coincidences. To him, they come in the shape of the most unexpected discoveries. These Mexicans, for instance, whose obscure origin, according to the laws of probability, has no connection with the Aryans of India, nevertheless, like the Hindus, represent an eclipse of the moon as the moon being devoured by a dragon. And though Professor Muller admits that an historical intercourse between the 2 people was suspected by Alexander von Humboldt, and he himself considers it possible, still the occurrence of such a fact, he adds, need not be the result of any historical intercourse. As we have stated above, the origin of the Aborigines of America is a very vexed question for those interested in tracing out the affiliation and migrations of peoples. Notwithstanding the labor of Brasseur de Bourbourg and his elaborate translation of the famous Popol Vuh, alleged to be written by Ixtaczoquitl, after weighing its contents, the antiquarian remains as much in the dark as ever. We have read the Popol Vuh in its original translation, and the review of the same by Max Muller, and out of the former finds shining a light of such brightness that it is no wonder that the matter-of-fact, skeptical scientists should be blinded by it. But so far as an author can be judged by his writings, Professor Max Muller is no unfair skeptic, and moreover, very little of importance escapes his attention. How is it then that a man of such immense and rare erudition, accustomed as he is to embrace at one eagle glance the traditions, religious customs, and superstitions of a people, detecting the slightest similarity, and taking in the smallest details, failed to give any importance or perhaps even suspect what the humble author of the present volume, who has neither scientific training nor erudition to any extent, apprehended at first view? Fallacious and unwarranted as too many may seem this remark, it appears to us that science loses more than she gains by neglecting the ancient and even medieval esoteric literature, or rather, what remains of it. To one who devotes himself to such study, many a coincidence is transformed into a natural result of demonstrable antecedent causes. We think we can see how it is that Professor Muller confesses that now and then one imagines one sees certain periods and landmarks, but in the next page all is chaos again. May it not be barely possible that this chaos is intensified by the fact that most of the scientists, directing the whole of their attention to history, skip that which they treat as vague, contradictory, miraculous, absurd, notwithstanding the feeling that there was a groundwork of noble conceptions which has been covered and distorted by an aftergrowth of fantastic nonsense. Professor Muller cannot help comparing this nonsense to the tales of the Arabian Nights. Far be from us the ridiculous pretension of criticizing a scientist so worthy of admiration for his learning as Max Muller. But we cannot help saying that even among the fantastic nonsense of the Arabian Nights entertainments, anything would be worthy of attention, if it should help toward the evolving of some historical truth. Homer's Odyssey surpasses in fantastic nonsense all the tales of the Arabian Nights combined, and notwithstanding that many of his myths are now proved to be something else besides the creation of the old poet's fancy. The Laestrygonians, who devoured the companions of Ulysses, are traced to the huge cannibal race, said in primitive days to inhabit the caves of Norway. Geology verified through her discoveries some of the assertions of Homer, supposed for so many ages to have been but poetical hallucinations. The perpetual daylight enjoyed by this race of Laestrygonians indicates that they were inhabitants of the North Cape, where during the whole summer there is perpetual daylight. The Norwegian fjords are perfectly described by Homer in his Odyssey X-110, and the gigantic stature of the Lastrygonians is demonstrated by human bones of unusual size, found in caves situated near this region, and which the geologists suppose to have belonged to a race extinct long before the Aryan immigration. Charybdis, as we have seen, has been recognized in the maelstrom, and the wandering rocks in the enormous icebergs of the Arctic seas. If the consecutive attempts at the creation of man described in the Quiche cosmogony suggests no comparison with some apocrypha, with the Jewish sacred books and the Kabbalistic theories of creation, it is indeed strange. Even the Book of Jasher, condemned as a gross forgery of the 12th century, may furnish more than one clue to trace a relation between the population of Ur of the Chaldeans, where magism flourished before the days of Abraham, and those of Central and North America. The divine beings brought down to the level of human nature performed no feats or tricks more strange or incredible than the miraculous performances of Moses and of the Pharaoh's magicians, while many of these are exactly similar in their nature. And when, moreover, in addition to this latter fact, we find so great a resemblance between certain Kabbalistic terms common to both hemispheres, there must be something else than mere accident to account for the circumstance. Many of such feats have clearly a common parentage. The story of the two brothers of Central America, who before starting on their journey to Zabalba, plant each a cane in the middle of their grandmother's house, that she may know by its flourishing or withering whether they are alive or dead, finds its analogy in the beliefs of many other countries. In the popular tales and traditions by Sakharov, Russia, one can find a similar narrative and trace this belief in various other legends. And yet these fairy tales were current in Russia many centuries before America was discovered. In recognizing in the gods of Stonehenge the divinities of Delphos and Babylon, one need feel little surprised. Bel and the dragon, Apollo and Python, Osiris and Typhon are all under many names, and have traveled far and wide. The Bothal of Ireland points directly to its first parent, the Batelos of the Greeks, and the Bethel of Chanaan. History, says H. de la Villemarque, which took no notes at those distant ages, complete ignorance, but the science of languages affirms. Philology, with a daily increasing probability, has again linked together the chain hardly broken between the Orient and the Occident. No more remarkable is the discovery of a like resemblance between the Oriental myths and the ancient Russian tales and traditions, for it is entirely natural to look for a similarity between the beliefs of the Semitic and Aryan families. But when we discover an almost perfect identity between the character of Tsarevna Militrissa, with a moon in her forehead, who is in constant danger of being devoured by Zmi Gornach, the serpent or dragon, who plays such a prominent part in all popular Russian tales, and similar characters in the Mexican legends, extending to the minutest details, we may well pause and ask ourselves whether there be not here more than a simple coincidence. The tradition of the dragon and the sun, occasionally replaced by the moon, has awakened echoes in the remotest parts of the world. It may be accounted for with perfect readiness by the once universal heliolatrous religion. There was a time when Asia, Europe, Africa, and America were covered with the temples sacred to the sun and the dragons. The priests assumed the names of their deities, and thus the tradition of these spread like a network all over the globe. Bel and the dragon being uniformly coupled together, and the priest of the Ophite religion as uniformly assuming the name of his god. But still, if the original conception is natural and intelligible, and its occurrence need not be the result of any historical intercourse, as Professor Muller tells us, the details are so strikingly similar that we cannot feel satisfied that the riddle is entirely solved. The origin of this universal symbolical worship being concealed in the night of time, we would have more chance to arrive at the truth by tracing these traditions to their very source. And where is this source? Kircher places the origin of the Ophite and heliolatrous worship, the shape of conical monuments and the obelisks, with the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus. Where, then, except in Hermetic books are we to seek for the desired information? Is it likely that modern authors can know more, or as much, of ancient myths and cults as the men who taught them for their contemporaries? Clearly, two things are necessary. First, to find the missing books of Hermes, and second, the key by which to understand them, for reading is not sufficient. Without stopping to discuss whether Hermes was the prince of post-diluvian magic, as de Musset calls him, or the antediluvian, which is much more likely, one thing is certain. The authenticity, reliability, and usefulness of the books of Hermes, or rather of what remains of the 36 works attributed to the Egyptian magician, are fully recognized by Champollion Jr. and corroborated by Champollion Fignac, who mentions it. Now, if by carefully looking over the Kabbalistical works, which are all derived from that universal storehouse of esoteric knowledge, we find the facsimiles of many so-called miracles wrought by magical art, equally reproduced by the quiches. And if even in the fragments left of the original Popol Vuh, there is sufficient evidence that the religious customs of the Mexicans, Peruvians, and other American races are nearly identical with those of the ancient Phoenicians, Babylonians, and Egyptians. And if, moreover, we discover that many of their religious terms have etymologically the same origin, how are we to avoid believing that they are the descendants of those whose forefathers fled before the brigand, Joshua, the son of Nun? Nunez de la Vega says that Nin, or Imos, of the Sandales, was the Ninnis of the Babylonians. It is possible that so far it may be a coincidence, as the identification of one with the other rests but upon a poor argument. But it is known, adds de Bourbourg, that this prince, and according to others, his father, Bel or Baal, received, like the Nin of the Tendales, the homages of this subject under the shape of a serpent. The latter assertion, besides being fantastic, is nowhere corroborated in the Babylonian records. It is very true that the Phoenicians represented the sun under the image of a dragon, but so did all the other people who symbolized their sun gods. Belus, the first king of the Assyrian dynasty, was, according to Castor, and Eusebius, who quotes him, deified, i.e., he was ranked among the gods, after his death only. Thus, neither himself nor his son, Ninus or Nin, could have received their subjects under the shape of a serpent, whatever the Sandales did. Bel, according to Christians, is Baal, and Baal is the devil. Since the Bible prophets began so designating every deity of their neighbors, therefore Belus, Ninus, and the Mexican Nin are serpents and devils. And as the devil, or father of evil, is one under many forms, therefore, under whatever name the serpent appears, it is the devil. Strange logic. Why not say that Ninus, the Assyrian, represented as husband and victim of the ambitious Semiramis, was a high priest as well as king of his country? That as such he wore on his tiara the sacred emblems of the dragon and the sun. Moreover, as the priest generally assumed the name of his god, Ninus was said to receive his subject as the representative of the serpent god. The idea is preeminently Roman Catholic and amounts to very little, as all their inventions do. If Nunez de la Vega was so anxious to establish an affiliation between the Mexicans and the biblical sun, and serpent worshippers, why did he not show another and a better similarity between them without tracing?
Wake up, wake up, wake up, it's the birthday of mine. Get it, get the tick and come on. Strawberry, raspberry, chocolate, all the flavors.
In the Ninevites and the Sandales, the hoof and the horn of the Christian devil. And to begin with, he might have pointed to the Chronicles of Fuentes, of the Kingdom of Guatemala, and to the manuscript of Don Juan Torres, the grandson of the last king of the Quiches. This document, which is said to have been in the possession of the lieutenant general appointed by Pedro de Alvarado, states that the Toltecas themselves descended from the house of Israel, who were released by Moses, and who, after crossing the Red Sea, fell into idolatry. After that, having separated themselves from their companions, and under the guidance of a chief named Tanub, they set out wandering, and from one continent to another they came to a place named the Seven Caverns. in the Kingdom of Mexico, where they found the famous town of Tula, etc. If this statement has never obtained more credit than it has, it is simply due to the fact that it passed through the hands of Father Francis Vasquez, historian of the Order of San Francis. And this circumstance, to use the expression employed by de Musset in connection with the work of the poor, unfrocked Abby Huck, is not calculated to strengthen our confidence. But there is another point as important, if not more so, as it seems to have escaped falsification by the zealous Catholic padres, and rests chiefly on Indian tradition. A famous Toltecan king, whose name is mixed up in the weird legends of Yucatán, the ruined capital of the great Indian kingdom, bore the biblical appellation of Balaam Akan, the first name being preeminently Chaldean, and reminding one immediately of Balaam and his human-voiced ass. Besides the statement of Lord Kingsborough, who found such a striking similarity between the language of the Aztecs, the mother tongue, and the Hebrew, many of the figures on the bas-reliefs of Palenque and idols in terracotta, exhumed in Santa Cruz del Quiche, have on their heads bandelettes with a square protuberance on them, in front of the forehead, very similar to the phylacteries worn by the Hebrew Pharisees of old, while at prayers, and even by devotees of the present day, particularly the Jews of Poland and Russia. But as this may be but a fancy of ours, after all, we will not insist on the details. Upon the testimony of the ancients, corroborated by modern discoveries, we know that there were numerous catacombs in Egypt and Chaldea, some of them of very vast extent. The most renowned of them were the subterranean crypts of Thebes and Memphis, the former beginning on the western side of the Nile, extending toward the Libyan desert, and were known as the Serpent's Catacombs, or passages. It was there that were performed the sacred mysteries of the Kukos Anakis, the unavoidable cycle, more generally known as the circle of necessity, the inexorable doom imposed upon every soul after the bodily death, and when it had been judged in the Amanithian region. In de Bourbourg's book, Wotan, the Mexican demigod, in narrating his expedition, describes a subterranean passage, which ran underground and terminated at the root of the heavens, adding that this passage was a snake's hole, and that he was admitted to it because he was himself a son of the snakes, or a serpent. This is indeed very suggestive, for his description of the snake's hole is that of the ancient Egyptian crypt, as I mentioned above. The hierophants, moreover, of Egypt as of Babylon, generally styled themselves the son of the serpent god, or sons of the dragon, not because, as de Musset would have his readers believe, they were the progeny of Satan Incubus, the old serpent of Eden, but because in the mysteries the serpent was the symbol of wisdom and immortality. The Assyrian priest bore always the name of his god, says Movers. The Druids of the Celto-Britannica regions also called themselves snakes. I am a serpent, I am a druid, they exclaimed. The Egyptian Karnak is twin brother to the Karnak of Bretagne, the latter Karnak meaning the serpent's mount. The Dracontia once covered the surface of the globe, and these temples were sacred to the dragon, only because it was the symbol of the sun, which, in its turn, was the symbol of the highest god, the Phoenician Elon or Elion, whom Abraham recognized as El Elyon. Besides the surname of serpents, they were called the builders, the architects, for the immense grandeur of their temples and monuments was such that even now the pulverized remains of them frighten the mathematical calculations of our modern engineers, says Taliesin. De Bourbourg hints that the chiefs of the name of Wotan, the Quetzalcoatl or serpent deity of the Mexicans, are the descendants of Ham and Canaan. I am Hivam, they say. Being a Hivim, I am of the great race of the dragon, snake. I am a snake myself, for I am Hivim. And de Musset, rejoicing because he believes himself fairly on the serpent's, or rather devil's, trail, hurries to explain. According to the most learned commentators of our sacred books, the Chivim or Hivim, or Hevites, descend from Heth, son of Canaan, son of Ham, the accursed. But modern research has demonstrated, on unimpeachable evidence, that the whole genealogical table of the 10th chapter of Genesis refers to imaginary heroes, and that the closing verses of the ninth are little better than a bit of Chaldean allegory of Sisuthros and the mythical flood, compiled and arranged to fit the Nochian frame. But suppose the descendants of these Canaanites, the accursed, were to resent for once the unmerited outrage. It would be an easy matter for them to reverse the tables and answer to this fling based on a fable, by a fact proved by archaeologists and symbologists, namely that Seth, Adam's third son and the forefather of all Israel, the ancestor of Noah, and the progenitor of the chosen people, is but Hermes, the god of wisdom, called also Thoth, Tat, Seth, Set, and Satan, and that he was, furthermore, when viewed under his bad aspect, Typhon, the Egyptian Satan, who was also Set. For the Jewish people, whose well-educated men, no more than Philo or Josephus, the historian, regard their Mosaic books as otherwise than an allegory, such a discovery amounts to but little. But for Christians, who, like de Maisonneuve, very unwisely accept the Bible narratives as literal history, the case stands very different. As far as affiliation goes, we agree with this pious writer, and we feel every day as certain that some of the peoples of Central America will be traced back to the Phoenicians and the Mosaic Israelites, as we do that the latter will be proved to have as persistently stuck to the same idolatry, if idolatry there is, of the sun and serpent worship, as the Mexicans. There is evidence, biblical evidence, that two of the Jacob's sons, Levi and Dan, as well as Judah, married Canaanite women and followed the worship of their wives. Of course, every Christian will protest, but the proof may be found even in the translated Bible, pruned as it now stands. The dying Jacob thus describes his sons. Dan, says he, shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that bitteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Of Simeon and Levi, the patriarch, or Israel, remarks that they are brethren, instruments of cruelty, are in their inhabitations. O my soul, come not thou in their secret unto their assembly. Now in the original, the words their secret read their sod, and sod was the name for the great mysteries of Baal, Adonis, and Bacchus, who were all sun gods and had serpents for symbols. The Kabbalists explain the allegory of the fiery serpents by saying that this was the name given to the tribe of Levi, to all the Levites in short, and that Moses was the chief of the Sodalites. And here's the moment to prove our statements. Moses is mentioned by several old historians as an Egyptian priest. Manetho says he was a hierophant of Hierapolis and a priest of the sun god Osiris, and that his name was Osiriph. Those moderns who accept it as a fact that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians must also submit to the right interpretation of the word wisdom, which was throughout the world known as a synonym of initiation into the secret mysteries of the Magi. Did the idea never strike the reader of the Bible that an alien born and brought up in a foreign country could not and would not possibly have been admitted? We will not say to the final initiation, the grandest mystery of all, but even to share the knowledge of the minor priesthood, those who belong to the lesser mysteries. In Genesis 43:32, we read that no Egyptian could seat himself to eat bread with the brothers of Joseph, for that is an abomination.
Okay, that was chapter 14. Um, Egyptian wisdom. So this chapter got pretty deep. I already knew it was gonna get deep, so let me just go over the notes, right? We got so the Egyptians they was hit with hydrostatics. They was using water for electricity, power, and they was moving shit with it. Greece owes everything to Egypt, their whole mythology, everything. Moses knew about electricity because Moses was tutored and mentored by the Egyptians. Um, the Egyptians made time-proof paper Back then it was called papyrus or a papyri. The Egyptians knew about astronomy. Astronomy is such a divine science, hence why they knew about it. Egypt is the birthplace of chemistry, aka the land of Chem. Chem is the birthplace of chemistry. They have beard in 2000 BC in Egypt. Hermes is also thought the Egyptian magician, the Kabbalion and all that good stuff. So the serpent and or the dragon represents light and or wisdom and or immortality, hence why they demonized everything that is a serpent, even the serpent that's in the Bible. Dragon is the symbol of the sun slash kundalini. Then something I thought was interesting, just as above, so below, right? Thoth is also Satan, is also Set, is also Noah. Thought and Noah, thought basically is mind, Noah, knower, knowing. So that's that. Satan is the Christian version of the devil, and Set and or Typhon would be the Greco and or the Greek or Roman version of the devil. And so the real gem is that having wisdom really is a secret initiation into the Magi society, meaning that you really know what's good. Ain't no miracles out here. So y'all let me know what y'all learned. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Peace.